The following account was found in a box of diaries purchased in a London auction house in 1977. While its validity remains questionable, certain records suggest that events similar to those described did occur in the Punjab province in February 1905. I did not know wealth as a young man. My father had a weak constitution and died of cholera shortly after my 20th year. With what money I had earned and what little he had left me, I bought passage to India. I had been told that a man could make a fortune there, and I was a fool then, for I believed it. For a few years, I wandered through the north, working any job that I could, and like this, I narrowly scraped by. Finally, in 1881, I found myself in a position on a steamboat, which ran supplies and guns to the outposts of the northwest frontier. It was only one job to begin with, but the captain offered to keep me on, and I was willing, for the pay was good. 2 jobs turned into 3, 3 to 4, and so on. What had begun as a temporary occupation turned into my profession, and for more than 2 decades, I worked up the Indus River. Throughout those years, I saw many strange sights and I met a great number of peculiar people, and I reckon I could tell 1,000 tales from those days. However, none rattled me so much as the incident at Palakani. I could only describe the entire episode and its circumstances as bizarre, and while it troubles me to admit it, nothing more than that singular event facilitated my retirement from the river service. It was in February of 1905, and it had started as a routine supply trip. By then, I was the second officer aboard the steamboat, Ursula, crewed by 10 and commanded by Captain Mueller, an aging Austrian widely known to be a martinet. We left Hyderabad at the beginning of the year and traveled 500 miles upriver to arrive in Nandla a month later. The way there was easy enough. We were not beset by any problems and everybody aboard was cheerful as could be. After arriving in Nandla, our ship was joined by a single passenger, a young lieutenant who had become bored with frontier life and was headed back to England after resigning his commission. After a day, the haulers had unloaded the supplies at the outpost, and soon we were ready for the return journey. We were away quickly, and all seemed well. The dry season never caused as much bother on the river, and we were glad of the rest. Normally, we would have stopped a few days for standard repairs. However, Mueller's efficiency was unmatched, and he insisted that we get back to Hyderabad for the next assignment as soon as possible. The overworked engine ceased after 2 weeks headed downriver, and we were forced to stop for onboard repairs. So it was that on an afternoon in late February, we docked at a small village nestled in an oxbow. The youngest of our crew, a Malton lad who had some knowledge of the area, told us that it was called Palakani. The landscape of the region was desolate and barren, but within 3 miles on either side of the river, swaths of dense brush and forest crept out into the watercourse. Palakani stood as a little dusty outcrop amongst an untouched sea of green. While Mueller ordered the engineer to assess the damage, I was sent for fresh water and food from the village, and to have a telegram sent to the shipping office in Hyderabad, alerting them of our delayed arrival. I took Daniel Thomas, the stoker, and Atma, the Malton boy, for I did not know the language. We were also joined by the young lieutenant, who was eager to stretch his legs after his long period of stagnation. However, As soon as we had drawn up along the banks, something struck me as odd. So many of the other sleepy villages along the meandering Indus had grown used to the river traffic, and therefore gave little attention to visitors. The only ones to ever take notice were the children, who lazily watched us from the banks and sometimes waved in laughter through rocks as far as they could. However, Palakane greeted us in numbers. All of us flocked to the sides to see dozens of villagers, arms raised, shouting for us to come down. Most of the men thought that this was some practice of hospitality, and they were eager to disembark. Mueller, however, who disapproved of congregating with the natives, ordered all of us to stay aboard. Only we four descended, and as we did so, the locals seemed to be gathering around the young lieutenant. Being of seniority, I had Atma translate the questions of the loudest village representative, a slender old man. "Where have you come from? How many are you?" he began. "We are from Nadla, heading to Hyderabad. We are here to purchase food and water." "Are there soldiers with you?" "No, we are not a military vessel. Can we buy supplies here?" "You help us, and we will give you water." "Help you with what?" "There is danger in the forest." Bandits were nothing new in the north. Afghan warlords have always seen it as their right to range across the frontier, raiding as they go. And I have known many hamlets and villages ransacked in the night, with groaning, wounded, and weeping children left behind to starve. I turned to Thomas, who had been in the river service nearly as long as myself. "Danny, how many arms do we carry?" "We have the 5 rifles, but as you know, Jack, they're rusted something awful," he replied. "That they are, Danny. Still, it might do to try and scare off the blighters." "Depends on how many of them there are," interjected the young lieutenant, who had been listening intently to all the goings-on. I nodded to Atma, and he gave the question to the old man. Atma listened and furrowed his brow. As he thought on the elder's words, I could tell that he was having trouble figuring out a translation. "I think, sir, that it is not a human danger. He says that it is a beast." "A tiger, no doubt," said the lieutenant. "Ah, well," said Thomas. "I reckon a few flares should see it off." "And how many flares do we have, Danny?" I asked. 10 or so signal flares. They burn dreadful crimson at night." "Grand. Then we'll scare it off tonight. Tell them we'll help them this evening, Atma. In the meanwhile, we'll have our food and water." Atma told the elder, but he and the rest of the crowd, who had been largely silent during our exchange, seemed to find this unsatisfactory, and they spent some time chattering amongst themselves. Eventually, the old man spoke up. "He says," Atma translated, "that they would rather help us help them now during the day. He says that it's dangerous at night. He says that it comes out at night." "Tell him that we have guns." "He says it makes no difference." "We'll see," I scoffed, although in honesty, I was becoming nervous. "Then tell him that we'll have to see what we can do." And with that, we returned to the ship. Mueller was barking orders down to the engineer, who was still deciding on the best course of repair. I joined the captain on the quarterdeck and explained that a tiger in the forest was causing trouble, and that if we killed it, the villagers would grant us all the food and water that we would need. Upon reporting the situation, He grew unusually contemplative. "Tigers, eh?" he finally said. "I don't think it's wise to go near the forest. Tell them that we'll pay in cash for the supplies." "I don't think they want the money, Captain Mueller. They seem to be more worried about the beast." "Well then, we will have to do without Mr. Daventry." "Very well, sir. But seeing as it wouldn't do any harm, might the lieutenant, Mr. Thomas, Atma, and myself take the rifles and scout around the village, just to put their minds at ease?" "Seeing as there is nothing to be done aboard at present, I will allow it. But I warn you, Mr. Daventry, no good ever came of chasing after tigers. You must return by evening." "Aye, sir." I descended and yelled for Atma to fetch the rifles from below. I joined Thomas and the lieutenant on the bow. "So what's the plan, Jack?" asked Thomas. "We'll look around for a bit. Not much else we can do." "What about the beast? The tiger? We can't pass up a hunt," said the lieutenant. "Mueller's orders. Besides, I haven't a clue about hunting, let alone tigers." Here the lieutenant became very excited and began to recount stories about his uncle's big game hunts in Africa, and how the same uncle had been employed in shooting tigers, which terrorized railway workers in Kenya. He even got out a ring to show us. He told us his uncle had taken it from one of the victims as kind of a memento. He seemed to have gotten it into his head that he was on an adventure, and ran off to his cabin to get his own hunting rifle. "He's got no patience, that one," Thomas remarked, as Atma handed him a rifle. "That he doesn't, Danny," I said as I slung mine over my shoulder. Once we were all ready, we came down the gangplank, much to the relief of the elder and his villagers. We were led by the old man through the settlement and in the direction of the distant woodland. As we approached from the Spinley dock, we saw the bay absent of any fisherman's dinghy or longboat, which was unusual for the hamlets of the Indus. The village itself was a meager assortment of huts and bungalows, all centered around a meeting hall. Smoke rose from perhaps half the buildings, but even with such a large crowd, it did not seem very populated. There were empty traps and nets hanging from the buildings, all of which were vacant. We were led onward through the settlement and into the fields. Except for our guide, the villagers began to disperse as we traversed further along. The wind blew over the small plain and whistled through the dry maize, which rustled all around us as we proceeded. Beyond, we could see the forest, and the closer we got, the denser it looked. We were about halfway between the village and the forest when the old man stopped. He stood before a post, and he would not take his eyes off the woods in front of him. While the rest of the woods had been harvested, the land beyond the post had evidently been abandoned, leaving a markedly barren territory. The lieutenant looked as if he were about to continue, but the elder grabbed his arm and looked into his eyes with terror. Atma translated his warning. "He says that the marker should not be crossed so close to the day's end. Would he have us come back tomorrow? We can't kill the damn thing if we can't get in the forest." The old man looked fraught with fear, and was nervously shifting his weight. His discomfort soon became our own. The lieutenant had taken a ring in the shape of a snake from his tunic, and slipped it on his finger. It was the one from Kenya. "Come on, the sooner we get it over with, the better," said Danny, and he was the first forward. The lieutenant joined him, as did I. Adma looked just as frightened as the old man, and I said that he could stand guard if he wished, which I think relieved him greatly. As we went off the road, the forest seemed to loom. It was lit up beautifully with the afternoon sun behind it, and a few rays of light seemed to penetrate its canopy. But it made it seem so much more immense, so much more impenetrable than when we saw from the Ursula as we chugged along the river. Stumps of corn lay uncollected and rotting beneath our boots, and they made an awful crunch as we stepped through them. "That's strange," observed the lieutenant. "What's that?" I said. "There's another post here, and over there, another one." At intervals ranging from a few feet to several yards, the path bore a series of wooden posts. All of them were painted red and decorated with an assortment of plants, flowers, and small bits of animal bone. "What do you think they mean?" I asked. "I haven't the foggiest," he replied. "It's simple," began Thomas. "They put one up for every victim." His solemn hypothesis put us all in a somber state as we passed by the 10th or so marker. "It must be getting bolder," said the lieutenant. "Or it's realizing," said Thomas. "Realizing what, Danny?" "Realizing they can't do nothing about it." We said nothing more until we came to the end of the deserted fields. Small bushes and a few fig trees had taken hold on the side of the fence that marked the beginning of the settlement, and they turned into the forest further along the path. Apart from the buzz of insects in the pasture, the forest seemed to be enveloped in an eerie silence. "This place gives me the fear," muttered Thomas. "What's the plan then?" I asked. The lieutenant, who looked far less enthusiastic than he had an hour before, thought for a full minute before he spoke. "I say we go up the road a ways, look for any pathways in the brush. The first thing we need to do is find the lair, and then we'll flush the bastard out." Thomas and I took this formulation as sufficient, and we nodded in agreement. He took the lead and we followed up behind, our rifles unslung. The path had not been traveled in some time, and roots and weeds had begun to cleave their way through the dry earth. Arms and branches of ancient hardwoods crept out above, as if they sought to reclaim the narrow strip of road. Neither birdsong nor the monotonous chirp of insects were to be heard, only the wind far above. It had been a hot day, and the ground was caked in dust, but here, it was like entering a cellar. However, the cool air was not welcoming. My skin crawled with the sudden chill and I rolled down my shirt sleeves. Danny, who was ahead of me, was looking back and forth nervously. "It's not right," said Danny. "Quiet, man. If the bugger hears us, we'll never find him," hoarsely whispered the lieutenant. "What couldn't hear us here? We must be the only living things in this godforsaken place," said Thomas. "That's why he's preying on the villagers. My uncle told me about this sort of thing. It was the same in Kenya with the railway workers. When the lion runs out of beasts to hunt, he comes for man." He dramatically bore his hand into a fist to show the snake ring on his little finger. "How many villagers would you say there were, Jack?" asked Thomas. "I don't know, 50? Maybe more," I postulated. "And how many huts did you count?" "God, I don't bloody know. I wasn't counting them as sheep, Dan." "Well, I did, and I tell you there's something off here. There were 30 huts or more, and I've known with a population of 100 live in fewer than 20. What's your point, Danny? There's just too few of them. Again, this somber remark turned us quiet, and for the better part of an hour, we eased our way up the woods. Not once did we see any disturbance in the foliage, and no pathways that the tiger could have used appeared. In fact, the further that we went, the worse it got. The silence seemed to pierce our ears. A kind of pinching hum emanated from all around. I think we all hoped the wood would run out and we would be greeted by the familiar bleak plains of Punjab. But no such luck. Through the canopy, the sky seemed darker, and it was clear that night would be upon us soon. I say we turn back, I said, and the others gravely nodded. We trekked back quite carelessly, and even if we had maintained a cautious retreat, there is no chance the beast hadn't realized our presence. I hoped that it was satisfied in our bold advance, and that it would not return to the village. However, I quickly dismissed this wishful thinking. We emerged from the wilderness just as the sun declined behind Ursula's funnel, and we saw the elder and Atma sitting by the distant marker. Atma stood up and waved, a cheerful sight. Although I pitied the villagers, I was glad at the prospect of getting back on the river. "Look there, Jack," said Danny, pointing. For the first time, I saw that the small riverboats had been piled between the outermost huts, so as to create a kind of barricade. Poor blighters. We were led back, and as we passed through Palakani, the villagers had changed from a bare hope to a doleful resignation. The faces of the little ones were undoubtedly the worst. I suspected that it had begun with the children. I asked Atma to tell the old man that we had found nothing, and that perhaps the beast was scared off by our presence alone. His response was silence. We returned to the ship quickly, where the lieutenant found the captain and spoke with him hurriedly. I talked with the engineer, who had assessed the damage as extensive. Ursula was hardly in her prime, and the replacement parts would need to be adjusted. Having underestimated the extent of our engine troubles, Mueller had withdrawn to his cabin to make preparations for the journey tomorrow morning. The prospect of being moored to that place, that cursed village, unsettled Thomas and I, and we leaned over the bulwarks gazing at the forest's edge for some time. We knew that the beast, or whatever it was, would not cease its attacks on our account. "I have an idea," said the excited lieutenant, who had decided to interrupt our vigil. "Good evening," I said. "We'll light the place up. Get a perimeter of torches. That way, we'll be able to see it coming and kill it at a distance." "We're not sharpshooters, Lieutenant," I said. "Well, perhaps not, but I'm a decent shot from a few hundred yards. I think I could ease down close by the tall leaves, close enough to wound the beast at least." "It seems like a fool's errand," said Thomas. "What does the captain think?" "I have spoken with Mueller. He seemed unconvinced but allowed us the materials." I looked at Danny. He said nothing. He was right, it was a fool's errand. But I agreed that it was better than doing nothing. The lieutenant recruited Atma to find yard posts, rags, and a care of paraffin oil. We helped him carry it all down to the village and into the outer fields. The villagers and their elder watched us from the barricade, tentatively whispering to one another. The four of us spent the better part of an hour hammering in posts a few feet apart, 100 yards or so around the barricade of boats as we worked against the setting sun. The darkening day cast long shadows as we punched the last post into the dry earth. As the sky sank from pale red to dim purple, we wet the rags in paraffin and set the post alight. We laid damp blankets below so as to stop the fields from catching fire, and then all of us retired to the village, save the lieutenant. He scouted out a shallow mound behind which he took up his position, rifle in hand, barely 100 yards from the torches. Thus began our lonely night. We had been waiting no more than an hour when Thomas spoke up in his usual dismal mood. "What are we going to do if he gets himself killed?" "It beats me, Danny, but I don't think he's that much of a fool." "I reckon we'll need our rifles before the night's out," he said dolefully. "Very well. You go with Atma and get the 3 best ones, and 24 rounds for each man, just to be sure." He nodded and off they went, leaving me in the company of the 2 villagers who hadn't withdrawn into their huts. The lieutenant was crouching perfectly still, his rifle tilted back behind the mound, his head peeking out into the darkness. He had taken off his pith helmet and laid it by his side, where a few cartridges had been conveniently placed. The torches flickered in the wind coming up from the river, and it seemed to grow exponentially darker as the deep blue sky turned to starless black. And then I began to hear it. It started as hardly noticeable, perhaps the result of yawning a few times in a row. But I knew that that wasn't it. It was that hum, that piercing hum that sent a spike into one's head, and it caused a wave of blinking. That dreadful noise, if I can rightly call it a noise, made me dip my head down and cover my ears. But even then, it just kept on, like needles had been driven into my ears. I looked up to see the young lieutenant, absolutely still. Worse than that, I could sense movement beyond. The darkness seemed to shift, but not like a beast moving within it. But the night itself was shifting around our solitary outpost of light, and we knew that it could, at any moment, envelop us. The lieutenant raised his rifle and aimed it at a confluence of movement. In one swift motion, he locked the bolt and pulled the trigger, and the deafening explosion sent a wave of screaming through the village. At once, every single one of the torches were extinguished. It was as if the candles had been blown out on a cake. The last thing that I glimpsed in the dim light of the burning posts was the lieutenant standing up to meet his end, rifle in hand. I froze. The calamity of the situation dawned on me as I turned back to the ship. Distantly, I could make out the silhouettes of men by the gangplank. Danny's voice cried out for me, and I ran towards the sound. Behind me, I could sense it moving. The whole darkness had surrounded the village. I could have tripped at any moment, for I would have been running blind had it not been for Ursula's gas lamps. I dared not look behind me, for that electric hum snapped at the hairs on my neck. Just as I was sure that it had caught me, someone let off a signal flare and the whole plane was illuminated in the horrible crimson light. I was not as far from the ship as I had anticipated, and it wasn't long before I reached the dock. At the gangplank, I was greeted by Danny, Atma, the engineer, and Captain Mueller, all armed to the teeth. As I approached them, I looked back. The village and its fields were desolate and devoid of any trace of the young marksman. The only thing I spotted by the lieutenant's perch was his helmet, in the same place that he had left it. "What the devil were you thinking?" cried the captain. Mueller's face burned red with unrelenting rage, but behind his fury, I could sense that he had the same biting fear in his heart as the rest of us. I couldn't think. The hum had reached its full intensity, and I thought my skull would explode if it didn't subside. "He told us. He told you." "The lieutenant said he had spoken to you, sir. He said that he had told you his plan," Danny interrupted. "He did no such thing, Mr. Thomas. Now come on. If we are to have any decent chance of finding him, we must start within the next hour." Mueller scornfully peered at me. "You look ill, Mr. Daventry. You had best get back to quarters. Adma, take him back to the ship." "Aye, aye, sir," said the lad, and grasping my arm, we staggered back aboard. I did not exactly sleep through that night, for I heard so much shouting and commotion that it would have been impossible regardless. That throbbing noise would not leave despite feeble attempts to quell my agitation. But eventually, as the rest of them returned towards the dawn, I began to drift into dreamless and painful slumber. When I awoke, we had already left the village far behind. The last memory I have of it is bathed in the red light of the flares, and the villagers confusedly trying to get passage on the ship. Thomas told me they had scoured the fields well into the night, and only stopped when they ran out of signal flares. They found neither hide nor hair of the young lieutenant. Atma took the helmet back, although I don't quite know why. Mueller had ordered us away as soon as the repairs were finished, and as the ship sputtered to life and pulled away down the river, Adma and Thomas looked at the tired and haggard faces of the villagers as they peered at their last hope and disappeared behind the oxbow. Neither Danny nor Atma could not count the elder's face in amongst them. 2 weeks later, we reached Hyderabad. Mueller reported the incident at the magistrate's office. It was only when we wired the news of the lieutenant's disappearance to the Nanda outpost that we realized that none of us remembered his name, although he had certainly told us it. That was my last job on the Indus. I haven't seen that place since, nor should I care to. However, I'm afraid that was not the last I heard of Palakani. Dan Thomas never stopped working the rivers, as he had known no other life, but migrated south after the incident. It was only 8 years later that we had a chance meeting in Kochi, where I had found work in the shipping office. Of course, we shared a few drinks, and a few turned to many, and we talked about the old days on the river, and old Captain Mueller, who had apparently died 2 years back, and how the rest of the lads were doing. Eventually, our conversation drifted towards the end of my career, and inevitably to the subject of the Palakani incident. "They had an investigation, you know," he said after a long silence. "The provincial superintendent even got Atma to lead him and his men up the river, up that very same route, just to see where the poor blighter had got to. And nothing." He took a long swig from his glass. "Nothing. They went in one side of the oxbow and came out the other without any break in the trees. It was like..." Danny paused, and he shifted in his seat. His eyebrows lowered. "It was like there had never been a village there at all." There was another long silence before I spoke. "Did you ever find out his name?" "Oh, somebody told it to me, but I've forgotten, Jack. I shouldn't like to remember it anyhow. He took another long gulp. Mueller told me after that the tribunal ruled the death an act of God. The death? It was a disappearance, wasn't it? He shook his head and looked me in the eye. It was a full year after. A bloody year. A hand washed up in Nanla. It had that ring, Jack. On the little finger. Remember, that Kenyan ring. I remember, Danny. I could picture it now. The ring in the shape of a snake. Thomas filled his glass and he downed it at once. One of his old chums identified it. Christ above, Jack. It was as if it were sliced off that very day. Clean as a knife through butter. He shook his head again. Do you ever wonder, Jack, about what was in that forest? There weren't nothing good in it. Nothing at all. I can't help thinking of it. It's the same feeling you get on those dark nights, you know. Do you remember how dark it was? You couldn't see your own nose in front of you. It was a miracle it didn't get the lot of us. I think it could have, mind you. No, it were toying with us. It won out in the end. There weren't nothing that we could do. Nothing at all. He stopped, deep in contemplation. Anyway, that was the last that I heard of it. I solemnly nodded, and we finished our drinks. We talked a little more about the changing times, the river service, and the state of the Raj. But soon, we parted ways. It wasn't long after our chance meeting that I left India. That was 12 years ago now, and I haven't seen Dan Thomas since.